Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. I am back in my studio and I just had a long, beautiful, wonderful, I don't know about beautiful, I mean, they're both gorgeous ladies, conversation with a couple of beautiful, wonderful, gorgeous ladies. One named Sasha Ayad, who I've had on my show several times now, and one which is Ben GNC centric. She's got her YouTube channel. She covers detransition stuff mostly. So in this conversation, we talk about the internet, we talk about queer groups, and we talk about the ways in which teen development isn't necessarily working with the internet in the most healthy of ways, and what can we all be doing about that. So here you go. This is our intersection. I don't know what prompted us to talk all at the same time, other than that I think we all kind of like each other. But
Yeah.
there's the stuff that we've all been talking about that we wanted to talk about more. Did you two have any conversations that you wanted to bring to light here?
Well, we talked. I mean, we got to talk just because I don't know about you, Ben, but I felt like I know you from your online presence, and I feel like we kind of overlap on a lot of the things we're talking about, but we hadn't met. So we had set up a Skype call just to kind of meet each other, but it was informal. It was more just to kind of say
Like hang
hello,
out.
get to know one another. Yeah.
Yeah. But we talked about like porn and its effect on dysphoria a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, and like the confusion of sexuality, like combined with trans identity. Um, it was a long time ago. I don't remember what
Yeah.
else we talked about.
One more housekeeping thing. Let's refer to me as Benjamin and to
Yeah.
Ben as Ben, just so the
Yeah.
audience knows that when
Yeah.
Ben's spoken, it's to her, and when it's Benjamin, it's me.
Yeah.
And you brought up sexual confusion, or you mean the tension between being homosexual and being heterosexual? Is that what you mean by sexual confusion?
No, well, it's like if you're supposed to be a lesbian, and then that means you're supposed to sleep with trans-identified males and females, so you're technically bisexual. And if you're attracted to men, you're supposed to sleep with trans-identified females and males, so you're technically bisexual. How is that supposed to help with 13-year-olds who doesn't know what their sexuality is?
Huh.
And
Does
also,
that?
like, the whole thing of what perspective you're coming from. Like, if you see yourself like, I'm a man, I'm attracted to a man, that's like a whole other level of confusion than like, I'm a female who wants to sleep with a male, for example. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's really confusing for a kid to like say I'm this when their body is not, and then have to like have sexual interactions based on that.
Hmm. And
If that
that
makes
comes
sense.
through education, the education system, or like extracurricular LGBTQ kind of
I think
education
that's
stuff.
just like the LGBT, like, I'm gonna like the queer community these days. That's just like accepted of that's what it means to be that sexuality, is to include trans people.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but it's so like abstract for somebody who's just trying to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, what I see sometimes is, trans identified females who are attracted to boys. They identify themselves as gay boys. And so when they're looking to kind of role models to help them understand their own sexuality, they're really looking at gay men and gay male culture. Which, if you have a female body and you're trying to understand your own sexuality, but all of your um, kind of role models or the people you look up to for mentorship are gay males, you're really not getting a sense of what does it mean to have a sexuality in a female body. So that important kind of process of understanding yourself physically has been stripped from young women who identify as trans guys.
Mhm. And I think like also when you're constantly like identifying with like gay male role models or like gay men in like fan fiction or whatever, it kind of further alienates you from your body. Like you said, like you have no frame of reference for what's happening with you. You're just like consuming stuff that has nothing to do with your body or what your sexual behavior will be if you have any.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just confusing, I think.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
confusing, and also the thing about the thing about the internet is that you don't know how old the other people are in your community. So you go into a community, and a community that's founded on sexuality anybody can join that. And the developmental, the understanding that sexual development is a very powerful part of putting oneself together, and that sexuality and identity are intimately linked, and that if you do start to interact as a kid with adult sexuality, that can really set you on a course before you're actually ready to have control of that situation. And so with this whole community of acceptance, and it starts out probably being about acceptance, being about let's figure things out together. That figuring things out has so many different influences that can impact somebody. How do you even manage that? And then how do you give young people the tools to manage that?
What you said about young people experiencing sexuality in a community where the age is kind of like irrelevant, or age is just a number, all that shit. It really does mess with you, like from personal experience, just online. Like, you learn to be like the subservient person. You learn to be the person who's like, what do they need? I'll give it to them. Like, you learn to be like that person all the time. So like your own needs, your own desires, your own feelings are like completely canceled out or ignored. So it further alienates you from your body or your feelings. And then, it sets you in like a strange headspace for what sexuality is when you go out into the real world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like the concept of personal boundaries has gotten really fuzzy. And Ben, we've talked about this before in our call, and Benjamin, we've also talked about this, but it's interesting when young people are exposed to all of this terminology, all of this language and definitions, and it almost gives this like pseudo illusion of being sexually mature just because you know all these labels. And I find that people who tend to be a little bit insecure, let's say, who have found their way into trans identity, they also don't feel entitled to setting boundaries for themselves. And so it sets up this kind of power dynamic where people who are more assertive or more aggressive can easily end up taking advantage of somebody who's really young and feels like, well, according to this label, I'm supposed to be okay with all of these behaviors, and this other person's more experienced than I am, so I kind of have to show myself to be comfortable because I know all this lingo, like I'm supposed to be comfortable with this. And if somebody also has a history of working through a lot of anxiety issues, they can attribute their discomfort to their anxiety problem when really maybe it's just a personal boundaries issue. Like if you're sexually inexperienced, you're not supposed to feel super comfortable with everything right away. There's a natural kind of process of getting more comfortable as you trust someone and you get to know your body. But all of that kind of gets circumvented when you expect that because I know all of these labels and definitions, like I have to be okay with all of these behaviors as well.
Yeah, what you said, like a lot of kids, they're on Tumblr, they learn all the terminology, they're told like sexual empowerment is about exploring your sexuality, and like nobody ever mentions boundaries except like kink stuff where allegedly there is boundaries, but I mean with kids not really. And it really, so it sets you up to think like, oh, I know everything, so therefore I'm on top of this stuff. And like teenagers have that feeling of like, oh, I know what's going on, even though, like, no offense, they don't always. I didn't. And it really messes with them. And what you said, like the ability to set boundaries, I don't know any trans people when I was young that ever talked about, like, they never mentioned the word like boundaries or like, are you uncomfortable with this person or anything like that. It was never ever mentioned because it was just assumed that like this is what you're supposed to do and you're doing it.
It almost seems like it was set up specifically to enable predators to get away with a lot of different things. And maybe that happened afterwards, or maybe a system like that is just going to be exploited, a system that founds itself on tolerance. I'm not saying that everybody in that community is a predator. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying a community that's founded on one, sexuality, and two, acceptance, and then all these labels to kind of negotiate those two things is going to it's going to incentivize some bad actors. Yeah, and then there's no oversight, like we talked about when we first spoke. There's really no oversight for these youth groups. Yeah. We have adults coming to these groups, and what are they trained in? Where are they
Nothing.
from?
Yeah. Like when that whole thing happened with that, I forget the name of the company, but that charity where that guy was doing something horrible in the washroom and it was a childhood safeguarding. That was
Mhm.
the first time in my entire life that I heard the term childhood safeguarding. I'm 100% sure that all of the youth group people that I met who run the youth groups had no idea what that was and never read that stuff. Like
Um,
they never acted in a way that was like, oh, maybe you should have some boundaries with adults, or maybe hanging out with everybody you meet online is not safe. Like nobody ever said anything like that to us.
if I recall correctly, that what you're speaking of was a man who was working for a children's specific charity, who was also into kink, showed up to work with his leather clothes under his work clothes, and
I
then
think it was
posted,
rubber.
or rubber clothes or something like that, and then posted on the social media that he had just masturbated in the washroom, and like showed a picture of himself, like he was proud and something.
Like with his
So
own name. Like the kids that he works with could Google that.
okay, yeah,
Like,
and so child safeguarding came from the discussion around that, or was this group about child safeguarding? Do you recall?
oh no, I just had never heard of the term
Okay.
before or the concept, which I feel like is weird. Like I should have known about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like spending so much time like with
Mhm.
people sending me porn and stuff as a teenager.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
I think there's something interesting going on too with like the conversation around consent, because I feel like there are two sides to the same coin. So on one hand, what you mentioned, Benjamin, about it's almost like the system was set up to facilitate, like, I guess, perpetrators of this. When you look at the behavior of people who groom children for sexual abuse, there is this kind of step-by-step process, and one of the things that they often do is expose children pretty young to sexual materials to almost desensitize them, to normalize having that sexual component be a part of their relationship. So on one hand, I see some of that happening with the way the kink communities and all of the sexual content has made its way into LGBT. But I also think, on the other hand, there are these explicit conversations that people are now supposed to have about the sexual contact before the sexual contact happens. And so it gives this illusion that they are setting boundaries. So I know, like, even very inexperienced young people, before they engage in sexual contacts, they kind of set out, like, are you comfortable doing this? Are you willing to do this? And they have an explicit conversation about what is going to happen. But the problem with that is, if you are inexperienced and you don't know your body very well yet, and you don't know this partner well yet, you can decide ahead of time that you're comfortable with behavior A, B, and C, but then when it comes down to it, you may not feel comfortable at all. You might be scared out of your mind. And so having this conversation before engaging sexually, like, I think it can be useful and it has a good intention, but it doesn't really work to facilitate like a natural, comfortable process throughout whatever sexual encounter it is.
Yeah. Like on Tumblr, there's a lot of, or not a lot, but I used to see these like checklists, and it's just like literally like a PDF that's like 4 pages long of like every sexual activity possible. And you sit down with your partner and you say yes, no to everything. And whatever you matched up on, those are the things you can do. And I think it's meant to be, it's like a consent thing to show the kids like,
Right.
like, but I think a lot of what ended up, like, I even knew like 2 people who use that chart thing with their partners. And a lot of what ends up happening is just like, oh, you said maybe to that one. And then they end up pressuring them and they end up doing it. Or just talking about this PDF is like a way to like kind of guilt someone for not being cool with everything on it. Do you know what I mean? Like the concept of it is enough to push someone into doing things they didn't want to do. It's really convoluted.
Do you think that there needs to be and this is not, I already feel the heat for asking this, but do you think that there needs to be some housekeeping, quote unquote, done within the LGBTQ community to separate itself from different forms of sexuality and kind of do a split between, it's one thing to be a homosexual, it's another thing to have a community about finding sex, and children aren't allowed in here. We're going to kind of revise what binds us together. Is that possible, or do you think it's warranted? Because I've been doing this story. Well, I mean, Jonathan Yaniv, Jessica Yaniv is in the news again, and you know, I did another video because I had some more material to share with people, and they're like, the LGBT community needs to police itself or needs to do some house cleaning, and when I did an episode about Pride, people would say like, gay people came in and said, I want to start distancing myself from this because it's going in this weird direction, and I wonder if that's not going, if that doesn't happen, if there's not some sort of separation between, let's say, the homosexuals and these various sex communities, then they are going to be lumped together again in the imagination of worried normies, and then it will just restart a cycle of abuse and vilification and all the various phobias that are now founded on something to be scared of.
I made a video about going to Toronto Pride, and most of the comments that I got were from homosexuals who were like, yeah, I don't go to Pride. I don't want to see nudists and kinksters. And they're like, yeah, I'm gay. I would go, but I don't want to see that stuff. What you said about like mixing it all together, there's like furries at most prides, and little kids go up to them and think that they're like, oh, it's like a big teddy bear or something. And this is like literally like a sexual fetish. Like, I had a friend at Pride who was like running around telling parents, like, little kids are going up to the furries, and she was like telling the parents, that's a fetish, don't let your kids play with those people. And like, this is what we were trying to prove before, like 20 years ago, that homosexuals are not predators, that they're not just fetishists, that they're not just perverts. And now we've mixed it all together, and when somebody looks at the news for Pride, what do they see? They see all the kink stuff. Like, we've gone back so far. And what you said about like policing, like the terms policing and gatekeeping are like big red flags of like, no, bad, bad, bad. So like, I don't really see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah.
And it seems like the people who are in power in LGBT organizations, like they've completely capitulated to queer theory, regardless of whether they or not they feel that it's true. They just like, they don't have any like confidence to go against the trans lobby, I guess. I don't really see it being possible for like for Pride Toronto, for example. I don't think they're gonna like police everything and make it clean within the next like 5 years or something. What I've noticed is, with lesbians at least, is that we're like creating some of our own like little spaces in real life and our own little groups in real life to just like, we're lesbians, let's hang out. It doesn't have to be about like sex and fetishes and stuff. And I think like that kind of group could be really beneficial to people, like to children who are like just exploring their sexuality, to just be around some people in like a neutral, comfortable setting and feel it out. Not like kinksters running around like in a dog mask next to you. Yeah. That's what I have to say.
Well, it's just odd that young people are exploring their sexuality around strangers. Like, that's never been the way it was when we were, rising as a species. But now that we're in this brave new world, people's development is happening, is being influenced by so many different movements and stuff like that. And I understand what you're saying about the lesbian community, just forming that. But at the same time, like, somebody's development of their sexuality should happen probably around people their age and nobody else. And
yeah, I
I'm
agree.
sure that Christians would say no sexual development until marriage, but that's not exactly going to happen.
Yeah.
Sasha, what do you think?
No, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about this study that I read and posted about recently from 2005, so about 14 years ago, and it was about butch lesbian identity development. And they wanted to come up with a model for how these identities develop, similar to how we have models of sexual development in like typical populations. So one of the things they did was interview all of these women who describe their childhoods, and they describe what we would now consider gender dysphoria. But one of the important things that a lot of the women in the study said was that they felt very uncomfortable. They really didn't feel like they understood themselves. And then when they met other women who were a little bit on the masculine side, or were able to kind of take them under their wing and show them like, actually, there's nothing wrong with you. That was a really important part. So it wasn't about the sex. It had nothing to do with like the sexuality. It had to do with, you know, being able to understand and own the way you are in your body and the way you are in the world in terms of how people are going to identify you, how people look at you. So I do think there's an important component of identity development that involves like older people in a way that you might look to for mentorship. But I do think that the way LGBT has also broadened its boundaries so generally to include all kinds of sexual fetishes, or just like, for example, polyamory now is almost being treated like some sort of innate identity. And I think when you blow the category out like this, first of all, the loose boundaries allow for some predatory behavior to slip in unchecked, because it's kind of under this guise of like accepting everybody's sexuality. But also the word LGBT becomes kind of meaningless, and I think that's why you see fractioning off, where the lesbians are saying, well, we actually need our own group because this word is now meaningless. This umbrella term is now meaningless.
Yeah.
And is there a way to make that distinction in the way that we consider identity versus sexuality? And like polyamory, I guess it is a sexuality, but it's a life choice. You aren't born polyamorous. I mean, you're probably not even born monogamous, you know, but you are born probably as you develop with a certain sort of attraction to different sorts of bodies. But the way that those are arranged in a social setting is completely different than that. Is there a way to reframe the distinction of one's homosexuality or heterosexuality as being a component of their identity versus the fetishes and the variations on partnership?
Well, I don't think that homosexuality or heterosexuality needs to be an identity. It's just a fact. You don't need to like construct it into like an abstract something. It's just who you are.
Well,
like,
but you
know what I mean?
You're going to want to hang out with lesbians, and that's not an abstract category.
No, because lesbians are homosexual females, though. It's not like they identified that way. It's just who they are.
Okay. Yeah, but you still need to identify them as that, and then you identify yourself as that. I mean, I'm using the term identity not as the the identity politics term, but just that component of one's personality.
Yeah, it's really hard at the moment because, like, I know somebody who tried to join a lesbian group in a city in Canada, and they went to the group, and there's a bunch of male to female transsexuals, and based on the word lesbian, they're all lesbians, so it's fine. And also the opposite problem. A lot of lesbians are right now calling themselves non-binary, genderqueer, pansexual, or something like that, because it's more socially acceptable in their queer community, and it makes them less of a target. Like, I've literally spoken to lesbians who message me, and it says like pansexual on their bio in Twitter, and they're like, I'm married to a woman, I'm a lesbian, but I can't hang out with any LGBT people if I like say I'm a lesbian and they start asking me questions. So we have the opposite problem with lesbians who like won't publicly admit that they're lesbians for safety reasons. So like getting lesbians together is difficult. And like age group thing, I think is definitely like, I would have loved if there was like a lesbian youth group in Toronto when I was a kid. I don't know if I would have actually gone because I was so messed up. But if there was that, like Sasha said, just seeing other people who are like me, who are not trying to fulfill a role, who are not putting themselves into like the trans man box, who are not like trying to fit their experiences into the narrative of transition, to just say like, this is what happened to me, this is how I feel, I'm a lesbian. Like, that would have been literally life-changing for me. It would be amazing if we could get that kind of thing started, but at the moment I have no idea how we could do that. Yeah.
That's such a silly inversion of the categories that lesbian is now encroached by everybody who wants to sleep with lesbians. So the lesbian identity isn't held by the people who say, this is what I am. It's too embattled because there's this other group that wants to identify as lesbians. I guess this is where we get into that. What is an identity anyways? So that you have to actually say that you are a part of this misty cloud of sexuality. So I'm not judging anybody. It just so happens that I'm only going to actually have my business done with these other people over here. But in the community, because if you make that choice, there's gatekeeping involved, there's discrimination involved, just basic human discrimination, and that's bad. And I think that partially comes from queer theory, but also probably some bad actors.
Yeah, well, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, it's kind of like what you said before, is like, because everything is so vague and so open, it leaves space for predators. So same thing with lesbian, because everything is so vague and so open, it leaves space for like bad actors to come in and be like, I'm a lesbian, this is what lesbians do, this is like there are people on Twitter who have like hundreds of thousands of followers who are like males who call themselves lesbians, who are like trendsetters. It's like you said, and whenever there's space for a bad actor to do something, they'll do it. Yeah. So that's what we're seeing.
I think this is also one of the first times in recent history, at least that I can see, where somebody's identity is completely arbitrary in relation to how other people view them. So identity has always been something that's socially negotiated based on not just what you think of yourself, but the way the world interacts with you. So, I mean, racial identity is not something like, I'm not allowed to just say, you know, I'm actually Chinese because I feel that way. That would be something based on like my cultural heritage, where my family came from, where I was born, maybe where I've lived. So this is, I think, one of the first times where people get to declare their identity, and it's completely untethered to the way we actually live in the world and the way the world views us. And that's really interesting too, because if you think about people who are gay or homosexual, that's always been an identity that's hidden, right? So like you could be a person out in the world, a woman, let's say, who is a lesbian, who is a wife, and until recent times where there was more acceptance, you might have never said that to anybody. So in that way, that's an identity that is something you would have to reveal to another person for them to understand or to know more about you. But we've taken it to such a bizarre step where not only is it something that you have to share with another person, but it's something that could be observably not even true at all. Like to say, I'm literally a man, that's not observably true by anybody around me, but now it's just based on my declaration. And I mean, I'm not a historian, but it seems like this is the first time that that's happening.
Yeah.
Non-binary pansexual is the new closet that you get back into to protect yourself from this weird inversion of who's actually doing the most discriminating now, or who's championing the most harassment, I guess.
Yeah.
I also don't think that it's a random coincidence that so many young people are identifying as asexual. I mean, when we were talking a few minutes ago about some of the kind of hypersexuality that you see in a lot of very progressive, like queer circles, you know, a lot of young people are identifying as asexual. And I mean, in the course of my work, some people have even said, you know, I think I'm really just scared of sexuality. Like I'm afraid to be intimate with another person. And when you look at like a typical identity development, especially for gay and lesbian adults, most of them felt very kind of asexual for a longer period of time because they couldn't relate to their peers who were, you know, girls who were boy crazy or guys who were like interested in dating girls. So a lot of gay adults felt like their sexuality came in later. So I don't know. I just don't think it's a coincidence that in a hypersexualized, kind of like confused time to be a teenager discovering sexuality, a lot of kids are actually opting out altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no like middle ground. There's no chill sexual, you know.
Yeah.
Well, like just by labeling yourself as pansexual, that means like, oh, I'm ready to date someone. Just by having a label in your bio, it implies that you're like ready to go. And like a lot of these kids, it's like they read it on a screen, they thought that's what they are, and they put it on their bio. And they have no physical experience with attraction to XYZ, have no physical experience with sexual interaction with anybody. They just put it up there. And then there's a presumption that they're like open for business or whatever. It's So of course, like I know a lot of like I went through. I think I was like asexual for like 8 months or something. Like a lot of trans females do that. Because like they're so uncomfortable with their sexuality, they can't even contemplate being with another person. So asexual is like a shield. Like, okay, don't approach me. That's it. Yeah.
Like celibacy or something.
Yeah. Which is so sad. Like that your own peers would put you in a situation where you need to defend yourself from wanting to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to life as a female. I mean, I think that's how it is for, many generations of women can share similar stories with different terminology. And I'm sure there's a different type of pressure on males as well, because males are expected to be also like rearing and ready to go. And at least for some of the families I've worked with, if you have a male who's on the anxious side, who doesn't feel confident interacting with, girls that they like, that is a terrifying experience too. I don't mean to say that only women or young girls have that kind of pressure placed on them, but when teenagers are already so self-conscious and they look around at others, whether the others are posturing and pretending that they're very sexual or they really are, that's a very easy way to say something is wrong with me. Like there is something seriously wrong with my experience here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then they go looking for answers.
Like you said before, like if you're in the queer community and from a young age you're exposed to like porn and kink and your friends talk openly with you about what sexual activities they do and how wonderful it is and stuff, and you don't feel the same way, you're like, oh well, I must be asexual. I don't want to do all that crazy shit. Like it literally is about the community you're in. If they were out of that community, I don't think they would feel the same way. If they weren't exposed to like the hypersexualization that puts all this pressure, like watching porn, seeing like what females are expected to do, what the man might try and do to you, like all this like scary stuff. It makes complete sense why there's more and more teens identifying as asexual.
And I think I've brought this up before about positive male restraint or positive restraints for the male and the idea of chivalry or the idea of like old school morality that actually expects a man to restrain himself and then probably put some restraint on the females too. And we can argue whether those were ever balanced or not, but that kind of system probably developed because if you just let everything go mad, eventually the male sexual charge will, the male aggression, the biological, just basic male drive is going to end up taking advantage of more and more people. And then in these kink communities and these kind of these darkened corners, I think it's wide open for males to lose restraint, it'll attract men who don't want any restraint, and then allow them to not be judged anymore because restraint is off the table totally. So you're going to have a lot of abuse of the male, or you're going to have a lot of abuse coming from males onto females just because that restraint that I think is very necessary and very positive if done correctly is now inverted into that's the sin. That's the one thing that we are not allowing anymore.
Do you have something to say, Sasha? I feel like, well, honestly, I'm not like super up to date on male sexuality things, but or if I am, it's like gay stuff. So, I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, like in the sex positive community or whatever the frick, like definitely there are people who are praised for not having restraint. There are men who are praised for like acting out their aggressive fantasies or whatever. Like literally that makes you like put on a pedestal in some communities. And then of course they're like looking the other way when it becomes like actually abusive and harmful. And then you have like the other people in the community who either don't know that this person is abusive and harmful and they're looking up to them, or they do know that and they've learned that it's okay to look the other way when this happens because the person is like some kind of role model or something.
So it's not necessarily the behavior that's bad, though I'm not going to make that judgment whether or not deviant sexuality or atypical sexuality is bad or not. There's another level of analysis of what are the guidelines that by which the community keeps itself accountable, keeps itself safe, and balances the power dynamics so that no one group is going to be taken advantage of. Like there's sexuality is one thing, and then there's this social aspect of it that should be open to critique, because that would be the solution, perhaps.
But here's the thing, though. We've devised labels to justify any kind of aberrant behavior. So if you look at who identifies as a dom and who identifies as a sub, that is a really slippery avenue for abusive people to find a socially acceptable way to kind of dominate someone other than them. And it's so hard because, yes, it's a personal choice, but does psychology play a role in this, And it just, all of this makes me think a lot about anxious and insecure people. Where do they find themselves in these communities and in these kind of amalgams of labels? Like, what labels are they taking on? And people who are really aggressive and I don't know, trying to dominate another person, where do they find themselves? It's not just like an equal distribution, like, oh, this anxious person is going to get to be a dom. Like, probably no, they're going to end up as a sub.
Yeah.
And I also just kind of think about, like, males. Where do anxious males end up in this? I get the feeling from talking with a lot of families of boys that if they have a very kind of mild-mannered, anxious boy who doesn't see himself in these other maybe more aggressive types, sexual types, I think that's a possible explanation for why they start wondering if they're actually female. Like, I think there's an interesting kind of irony there, that we're actually not leaving room for the kind of atypical gender presentations of males, and we're not leaving room for atypical gender presentations of females. It just kind of like, it's almost like a process of evolution where, like, the most aggressive males are going to stay identifying as males, and then some of the most, I don't know.
All the late bloomers are going to be trampled. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, what I wanted to say about, you were talking about like psychology and kink, and honestly, like, I haven't really like researched this in the last couple years, but when I was in the like kink community online, there is this, they say everything is safe, sane, and consensual, as in you're not on drugs, you have a plan for safety, everybody consented. That's like the whole thing of kink. Everybody is in on it. Everybody knows what's up. My
Sounds
problem
completely
is
safe, sane, and sustainable.
Like, what is sane? Like, is sane someone who purposely hurts someone else to the point that they need aftercare? Is sane someone who lets someone else hurt them to the point that they need to go to the doctor? Like, I don't think so. And a lot of the subs that I know, they were literally, like, some of them that I really remember clearly they were like a rape victim who got a new boyfriend who likes playing out like rape fantasies, and that's supposed to like help them with their trauma or something. But what's happening is a predator has seen this like victim and noticed that they're a victim and like starts to like re-traumatize them because they're like more capable of that or something. Like, you just see that a lot in the kink community, a lot. So it definitely has a lot to do with psychology. Yeah.
It's interesting because I was going to ask, well, how do people end up in these groups? And maybe this is going too far, but it seems like the school system is now putting portals into this, and the school system's rush to embrace the LGBT community, and then the way in which the LGBT community has slid into queerness and then slid into all the sexualities. It's just like there's a portal. Like, oh, I'm bored, or I'm interested, or I'm anxious, and maybe this is just something that I'm going to end up exploring. And there's something might be I mean, pornography is very, very powerful, and we try to normalize it as something that just is. It's just there, you know. Like, what do you do about it? But it's very, very powerful. On a neurological level and on a psychological level. It really takes you up, and it'll be a place where you can just exist and not exist at the same time. And just you can feel things, but you're not feeling anything at the same time. So what kind of people are going to end up being attracted into this, and what tools can we put along their way to make them be aware of what they're doing or what's happening to them as they get attracted or involved in more and more extreme sorts of behavior?
Well, I think you can kind of, what you said about schools, like, I'm sure that's not their intention, but when they start to teach about LGBT stuff, and then the kids, maybe before that even, but the kids go online and Tumblr and stuff and find all the LGBT stuff, it's like you said, it's like a gateway. It's like, oh, you found that, then you slip all the way down to where people are sending you porn and stuff.
Especially if you're young, because that's really attractive. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a woman. I've never got a dick pic. But I'm sure if I was a young guy, if I was 16 or whatever, and I was interacting on those forums and somebody saw a picture of me, they're going to want to do that same thing. I'm going to be an object of desire in that community. Yeah. So we're opening up doors for people to interact with behaviors that, even if they can shrug it off, we can say, well, it's just a picture online, whatever, but there's all this other context that goes along with that starts to pull us apart. And then when you come out and you're an adult, and then you're just then starting to discover your boundaries and stuff, like it's gonna take so much extra time to kind of get back to an authentic way in which you can explore sexuality with another individual, if individual is your kink,
Yeah. It's like I said before, when you get into this young, you learn sexual behavior that's not realistic and not normal. And I think also, like you were saying, like, how can we help these people before they get to the point where they feel they need to identify into some kind of maybe violent sexual group? I think we need to have more conversations in the LGBT community about how our mental health impacts our identity and our sexuality and our behavior in our day-to-day life. Because I think it's just people, like, they glorify, like, oh, I'm so depressed, I can't get out of bed. And then you get like 10,000 retweets and everybody's like, yeah, me too. Like, that doesn't actually do anything. We need to actually explain, like, what it is you're feeling and how it's affecting your actions and how it's affecting how you perceive things. Because I think people, they don't have any chance to stop and question. They don't have any chance to kind of unpack. They're just affirmed, like, yes, oh yes, you're queer, oh yes, you're a sub, oh yes, you can do this, oh yes, you should explore. There's no space to stop and think about what's going on. So maybe that would be a way.
I've been thinking a lot about that, and when we have constant access to answers, or what we perceive as answers, the entire process of wonder and taking the time to just see what you actually think, it's gone. And a lot of the young people I meet, they describe this process where they get their first phone or they get their first computer, and when they start researching things, they often will say, I didn't know anything. My parents sheltered me, and there was all this information out there that I wasn't aware of. And so as they're reading, they're not really reading with a grain of salt or a skeptical eye. They're reading as though this is fact. All of this is fact. And even the way these communities like Tumblr and like Pinterest kind of glorify mental health problems, you can quickly solidify this identity like, I'm depressed, I'm an anxious person. Whereas, if you didn't have that technology, you might feel anxious, let's say, one day, and then you go about your day and you might tell your best friend, like, hey, I've been feeling anxious. But it doesn't become this cycle where you're continually putting that message out in the world and receiving feedback to confirm it. And that ramps up any negative experience you're having or difficult experience. And so the process of wondering about yourself, it's gone. Like, that's gone. Like, I remember, being a teenager and going through tough times, and I'd be like on my way home from school, kind of staring out the car window, just like thinking about my day, allowing my own brain, my own heart, my own mind to process things without a billion strangers from the internet telling me what to make of that. And I'm really nervous about what happens when that process of wondering disappears.
Mm-hmm.
It's brainwashing.
Well, you're crowdsourcing that form of development, your sexual development, and then what you're saying, like that whole processing thing, and then discovering like how much uniqueness of the human being comes from that quiet time and that just like playing around with the blocks in one's head, you know. And without that, then you don't get that fine motor skill of like understanding who you are, and then it just ramps up and ramps up and ramps up, and then you arrive in college, all of a sudden you're away from your parents, and then you're going to be wide open to various forms of brainwashing, various forms of very intense experience are going to call to you, because that intensity is going to take the place of interiority, of a depth perception of oneself.
Yeah. Well, it's like Sasha said, like, you put something out there and everybody reinforces it. So you're just co-ruminating about this bad thing over and over and over again. And it gets to the point where you feel that co-rumination is some kind of exploration. Like, that is your progress. That is making a difference, because that's like all you know. And it's like obviously counterproductive.
And it's called support, right? Like, I've heard parents say that when they tried to kind of reduce, and look, I think this is an interesting area, because Ben, you and I maybe have a different view on this, but parents have told me when they tried to reduce the amount of time that their kid was on screens and replace it with other things. I'm not saying just like lock your kid up in their room with no phone. I mean, like, engage with your kid, go do stuff together, talk with your kid yourself. Therapists told them, no, that's their support system. They need their phone. You know, like, their internet friends are their support system. So I think it's interesting, because what we understand as support has kind of changed. And I've seen this on Facebook, even with adults, saying, like, you know, people who tend to post a lot of very, very personal things will say, you guys don't know how much it means to me to have your support. Meanwhile, these are people, of course, friends online they've never met. So I feel like as a whole culture, what we understand of like how do we get support for our strife has changed. And I don't know, I think that's interesting. I don't know how much I agree that internet support is a real substitute for either like just sitting with yourself in your discomfort and figuring it out, or like having an intimate close best friend you can talk to, or like talk to your parent, or talk to, you know, your cousin or somebody in your life.
I think it has something to do with right now how, well, I've talked about this before, how if you're in the queer community, everybody is an outsider and they can't understand you and all this garbage. So you feel like the only way you can get support is by finding people who are like you. And I mean, in like 2010, finding people like you had to use the internet. I mean, now you could probably find trans people in real life to hang out with. But so like if you're a trans kid, you think like, oh, I need trans people to support me because they understand me. So then you end up with like all these like online friends who are trans, and you're like distancing yourself from everybody you know in real life. And what you said, Sasha, it wasn't until I was like 21 that I had like really close, good friends who loved me, who I could like relax and sit down and tell them about my day, and they wouldn't judge me. And I was like, this is what I needed when I was a teenager. Okay. I didn't have this when I was a teenager. It's not the same as talking with your friends on Skype and like crying about how horrible your dysphoria is. Like, it's not the same thing at all. And like, being able to hug someone, that is a big deal for me anyway. Like, it makes a huge freaking difference. Like, if you can hug someone when you're crying as opposed to being on Skype with them, that is like a huge difference that makes, I think like a lot of kids, they're so online that they don't understand what they're missing. I know I sound like an old person, but it's true.
No.
How did that affect? Was that like a great big pivot in your life when you started to hang out with people in real life? And how did you get to that point where you started to do that?
It's actually kind of funny. Okay, so like I got to university when I was 19 or 20 or something. And when I was 19. And then I detransitioned when I was 20. And then I started like making friends. Like, I was in a music program, so we would always, like, the musicians would hang out together, and, like, I was always, like, texted, like, we're going to the movie or something, and I would never go. And then I became friends with this, like, one guy, and then he was like, do you want to go to the movie with everyone? And I was like, okay. And then eventually, a lot of my people that I became friends with, they realized that I like to sit around in my house by myself, So they would like literally come to my apartment unannounced and be like, "You haven't seen anybody in 2 days. Let's hang out." And it makes like a huge difference. But like eventually people just started like socializing with me who I was comfortable with, and I realized like I can control the situation. I'm not like super anxious. I can do this. And like I had like agoraphobia for a while, and like just having people that like they were like, I don't understand what you're going through, but I'm your friend and I'm here to support you. Like you can do this, and like we could leave the house together. Like that made like a huge difference in my life. And it's something that having an agoraphobic friend online would not be a substitute for.
Right.
Yeah.
That says something about how the anxiety cycle feeds in on itself, and it really requires someone to kind of come in and interrupt your pattern with something that probably freaked you out a little bit at first, like who are these people randomly coming over to my place when I didn't exactly invite them.
Yeah.
To show you the value of that kind of in-person connection. That's amazing.
Yeah. And like also online, it's different when somebody in real life like takes the time to like come to your house or like go to your classroom or something and like physically see you and be like, how are you doing? Are you okay? And somebody who's just like, what's up online? Like it's a completely different level of engagement.
Yeah.
Which I didn't notice until I had people in real life I was friends with.
It requires a much greater commitment. You have to leave your house. You have to get in the car. You have to drive to your friend's house. You have to like commit to staying there. You can't just like close the computer when you're done.
Yeah, like I remember this one time I was in like this really deep depression, and I was eating only Domino's for like 2 weeks, and I hadn't taken out the garbage or done any dishes. It was like really bad, and it was minus 42 Celsius, which is about the same Fahrenheit. They match at 40, minus 40, and my friend walked from his house, which was like 20 minutes away, and he knocked on my door, and he's like, "You haven't been out of your house. You haven't been in class. Like, are you okay?" And I was like, who the hell walks 20 minutes in minus 40 just to see someone? I like the fact that he was there was like shocking to me. I couldn't believe like somebody cared that much. Like, yeah, it's completely different from somebody online being like, how are you doing today?
How did that change you, looking back on that now? What started changing after you started getting used to other people?
I think I just learned to be less scared of social situations, honestly. And I learned to like figure out who I was and wasn't comfortable with, and what I could and couldn't do in certain social situations that would make me more comfortable or less uncomfortable. It just kind of like pushed me out of my comfort zone to like explore being a social human. Yeah,
it's very difficult to get out of a comfort zone online. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Like there's no physical way to do it. So, I mean, you'd have to like reprogram or just go subscribe to other blogs or start talking to different people. So very difficult.
Yeah. The internet is like very reductive, honestly. Like it just concentrates everything like, oh, you're looking at this, boom, all of this in one place. And you feel like you know what's going on. And like, yeah, and like the brainwashing aspect, especially for teenagers, like once you're like, this is what you need to do to make the world a better place. Like this is what it means to be like a non-oppressive white person or whatever. Like they learn all this stuff, and even if they go somewhere else, they're not going to forget it. Like getting out of that is, I don't know, extremely hard.
Do you think that we'll adapt? Sasha, I guess I'll ask you this. Do you think that we'll adapt? Do you think that there's just going to be some portion of this generation that's going to be sacrificed to this, and then we're going to figure out how to deal with the online stuff? And if so, like, what do you think are some of the things that we're going to need to develop, the tools to deal with this tool that we're enmeshed in?
I feel like that's way above my pay grade, but
reach for the stars.
Okay. You can be anything if you want to be, right? That's what the internet would say. I think it's hard to answer this question for a couple of reasons. One of which is that my work is predominantly online. I work in a very controversial field. So the types of information that either comes my way or that I seek out seems to be a huge testament to what a bad kind of place we're in.
Yeah.
But then when I like hang out with people who don't have anything to do with like rapid onset gender dysphoria or any of these kind of debates, it's a whole population of people that are not part of this, that are not kind of dealing with the challenges of like these extremist kind of positions. So part of me wants to say, you know, maybe it's not impacting as much of the world as we think. But then, you know, even when you look at the broader kind of conversations that are happening in like academic freedom and, you know, all of these things that don't have to do directly with my field, it's spreading. And I also think as someone who works with teenagers, the high rates of mental health issues that can't be just simply attributed to more kids self-diagnosing, like actual mental health problems are a big deal. So I kind of think what's going to happen is the current generation, as they get older and they aren't maybe as equipped to deal with the life in 3D, like you said, Benjamin, there might be like something that is sacrificed along the way. I feel like older generations are concerned about it, but I worry that we're going to die out, and the more...
Well, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's a fact, right? I shouldn't say I worry that. Like, yes, we're going to die out. But I feel like the more we get focused on, like, technological majors in school and technological kind of Pandora's box, I don't know how we come back from it. Like, I'm not sure if there's really a way to find a balancing.
Well, I wonder if the generation that grew up with the internet is going to have much more weight or be even more stern about the way that they deal with their teenagers. But I think maybe the parents of teenagers now don't have the authority or the understanding, because they haven't lived through that yet. So maybe that's one thing that will develop. The relationship between the parent, the child, and the internet might be one locus of development. Another way, hopefully teachers will get on board with this, but maybe peers will just start to understand like that there's different ways of checking in with one another that's more real than... I mean, maybe it'll just go out of style that I support you for being depressed. Maybe that'll just be the mom pants of the Gen Z or something like that.
Complete guess, but I think the people of my generation who are in the queer community, like if they have kids in 5 years, I assume that they'll be the kind of parents who are like friends with their kids and who like go on social media with their kids. Like I assume like the people that I know, I could imagine them creating an Instagram for their child, like as a develop, like, oh, I have one, do you want one too? Like as a completely normal thing.
Like a mentor kind of relationship, like going out in the wild together.
That's what I assume will happen. Because I mean, if you spend like 8 hours a day on social media or whatever, and it's like your playground, it's where you're comfortable, why wouldn't you share that with your kid?
Yeah. Okay.
Like, that's what I assume. And also, like what you were saying, I think we need to have like something in schools to teach like media literacy, like what is real, what's fake, like how should you interpret things, like how should you question things, like it nothing to do with trans even, just like media. And then hopefully kids can like apply that to Tumblr or something. I hope, I don't know. And also just like in the same thing, talking about how like social media or like the technology affects mental health, because I know kids don't want to hear it, and they're like, I didn't, and I was like, everything is perfectly fine. But like you don't have to like hit them over the head with it. Just be like, this is what we know about it, maybe you should consider how you're behaving, how it is affecting you. Like I think if you just give the kids the tools to ask the right questions, that they can start questioning things. I hope, anyway.
I wish I could agree with you. I don't know if I agree with you.
On which point?
I just think through no fault of their own, young teens they just don't have the psychological maturity to manage themselves that way.
Yeah.
And again, not because they're delayed or behind, or it's just every single one of us as young teens, we were not able to self-regulate. That's just not something that they're capable to do. And these devices and this social media is engineered to be incredibly powerful. I mean, you cannot walk down the street without seeing every single 40-year-old like this. So how do we expect 13-year-olds to take, like, we're concerned about your mental health? Like, I don't think it'll work. Like, I feel like we are all very much being kind of manipulated by these devices. So that's what really concerns me. And I think you're right, though, that your generation is going to be online with their kids. Like, everyone will have an online presence that interacts with their kids' online presence. And I agree that that is probably going to happen. And how that impacts those relationships, that will be really interesting to see. You know, this is all kind of very new. Like, your generation is the first generation that had phones since you were probably like 12 or something.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that's going to do to family life. You know, like, will the family have an Instagram account? And then what happens when the kid posts something that the family's seeing on Instagram? Is there privacy settings? And then how does that impact discipline and engagement and hanging out together versus online hanging out? I mean, I'm really curious about all of that, but I guess I have a little bit of a cynical point of view on it.
Yeah. Well, it's possible that if you're on Instagram with your like parents on Instagram, that they'll be like, you'll never post anything sexual because your parents are there. It's possible this could have a positive effect, but I mean, I can't see the future. But what you're saying about like self-regulation, like teens can't regulate themselves. So you have like these parents now who are like being good parents, and they're like plugging your phone downstairs in the kitchen at night. Like, don't be on your phone all night. You can have it again in the morning. Like, even like really small basic things like that. And then the kids online saying that their parent is like a Nazi and they're evil and stuff. Like, it's like the internet is such a huge force to contend with. The like parents and kids trying to like figure it out. It's so hard. I don't know what the answer is, but definitely teens need some kind of tool to help them understand that everything is not okay with being on social media all the time and consuming that as fact all the time.
Well, Ben, I'm thinking about what you said in how the last, year of your life, you've met these in-person friends who've really extended themselves in terms of caring about you and being in your life. And I mean, I think the antidote to this internet pull is three-dimensional real relationships. And ideally, I mean, I know not everybody has this, but ideally the parents would step in and provide that kind of, love and care and guidance and mentorship for their kids. And I think it's really hard for kids who don't have that sort of relationship with their parents, because really other teenagers are not really a reliable source of friendship. So how do you even figure it out? I mean, how can you, as a child who doesn't have that kind of connection with their parents, how can you contend with the internet? And I mean, your story is really hopeful because you got to meet really great people who you can kind of rely on in real life. So I wonder if, the answer is, as people get older and develop real healthy friendships, if they didn't have a close family, that's maybe what helps them compare, oh, actually my internet life isn't as good as my real life if I've built these connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what to do. Like, exactly what you said. Like, when there's these teens who feel alienated from their family for like whatever reason, or they're gay and their family's not accepting, something like that. Like, what reason do they have to try and make a connection with their family when they could easily find the right people to do that with online?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It could be the case that anything that's developed to counter, to slow down the internet will just be countered with some other cool little trick that it does to get us to be involved in that. I just wonder if there's a way. You brought up literacy, and I was thinking about the LGBT cue, etc. stuff at school if there's shouldn't be a psychological component to that, and it's not just critical thinking, but it's like a mindfulness practice, or just instituting like some sort of solid connection to the body, and really grounding oneself in one body. A lot of the stuff that I've seen, the pattern with teenage sexual wrestling or gender dysphoria, it seems like these people, for whatever reason, aren't connected to their body. And what can get us connected to our body? Sports and I don't know, but like just there's realms of experience that are not being accessed, which then leads to atrophy of certain fundamental aspects of the human psyche that are rooted in the body.
Well,
and,
like sorry.
No.
You've seen like these studies where kids who are on their phones from a young age have like less good motor skills than like other adults, right? I think we're seeing the exact same thing, but like in a different perspective. So like all these people are not attached to their bodies, connected to their bodies, because they're perceiving everything in an abstract way from the screen, and they're thinking about it and they're putting it back, and it has nothing to do with their body. Like porn, for example, a kid watching porn. If like there's the teenager watching porn, they have no connection to their body in that moment. They're observing something on the screen. Like, I feel like a lot of what people are doing on the internet ultimately alienates them from their body, and it's so normal that nobody's noticing it. Mm-hmm. Like, and nobody's saying anything. And when you're a teen, that's very, like, has a huge effect on your development. And adults, I guess they don't have, like, the wherewithal to be like, it's affecting me. How can it affect them? Like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think with porn, it's even a little bit more insidious because it kind of short circuits this arousal, which gives the illusion that you're deeply in your body because you're having a physiological reaction. But really, it's like artificial sweetener or something. It's not real. It's not based on an embodied experience. It's based completely on something visual and cerebral, and it's like outside stimulation.
Yeah.
And the entire way we operate on the internet is just a bunch of that. It's all up here, and it's very disconnected from the body. And I think that's a problem for adults too. But I always wonder about this generation that's growing up online and what happens there. And there's so much stimulation. I mean, the number of images and ideas and sounds and visuals that come at you in the course of like spending a few hours on your phone, it's just an astronomical amount of stimulation that if you were just sitting outside at a park, for example, even if it's full of animals and birds and people walking by, you're not going to possibly have to process that much information thrown at you. Mm-hmm. And disparate information that's unconnected to each other. And how do we process that? It's like if you're at some sort of a parade, but every single float is about something completely unrelated, and you're supposed to like process all that really fast.
And then like hot dog vendors come and throw a hot dog in your face.
Yeah, what happens? What happens to our brains like that when you have a young brain? I have no idea, but I imagine it's not good.
Do you think that there's ways to inspire like imaginative exercises and stuff instead of going the warning route? I mean, we're diagnosing the problem, but I'm just wondering if there's ways to seduce people into fuller ways of experiencing life. We'll just kind of outstrip that supersaturation of stimulus, or that reduction of stimulus into, let's just say, with porn, a genital and then a bunch of images, and that's all you are. You're just a conduit between those things. Is there like imaginative exercises? Is there group projects that can happen where people are building things? Is there ways to be creative, and would creativity be one way of channeling embodiment into the screen or through the screen? You guys, that was a big question.
Well, like connecting with your body physically, I know quite a few dysphoric people, either trans, detrans, or never transed, who have a lot of success with like horseback riding, martial arts, dancing, sports, because it lets you feel that your body is capable of something. It lets you appreciate what your body can do. It makes you physically connected with other people, or like with an animal or whatever. Like, it really helps you stay like grounded in a physical way that you cannot get like sitting in a lecture hall or like sitting on your phone or like even like sitting around talking with real people. You don't get that physical connection to your body.
Unless there's
So
hugs.
yeah, unless there's hugs. I don't know how to like get people to do that kind of thing. I freaking hate exercising or anything. So I'm not like I'm kind of hypocritical, but like I think that would make a big difference. I assume. Like I went to a weird high school where we didn't really do sports, so I don't really have any frame of reference. I don't know if kids are doing sports now, like what they're doing, if they're doing it less because they're more like involved in technology or something. But and I think like especially like female sports. Yeah,
Why?
females need to connect with their bodies. I know a lot of, like off the top of my head, thinking of high school, like most of the teams were boys teams, and there wasn't that many girls teams. Like girls just didn't feel like it was a good use of their time, or they weren't that interested or something. I don't know how to fix that, but that's what I've noticed.
I think being embodied in that way is very important, but I think the activity alone is less of an important factor than the way we relate to ourselves while engaged in the activity. So I have a colleague and friend who's a really brilliant yoga teacher, and she often talks about how there can be someone who practices yoga, for example, every single day, but they come in, they get in the class, and they think, okay, every single pose has to be perfect. I have to nail every single movement. And oh my God, if this is starting to hurt, like, I'm not making any progress. And that way of relating to oneself is a reflection of how they probably relate to themselves the rest of their life. So you can be in sports, but if you use sports as a way to berate yourself, to always kind of criticize whether or not you're meeting a certain standard, that alone does not help you become embodied in a healthy way. The way you relate to yourself in that activity, if it is kind of patient, if it is self-compassionate, if it is making space for kind of varying abilities on different days, that is a way to build up some important skills that you can take with you in the rest of your life. It's not just about the activity. And a way we know that is a lot of young people who are gymnasts or, dancers have eating disorders and are very self-critical and do not have healthy relationships with their body. So the activity is not necessarily what can help you develop that way of being. Yeah,
I used to be a dancer. I used to dance 5 days a week and I was anorexic. Yeah. That's kind of where my journey began. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it has a lot to do with how society right now views positivity. Like everything is negative. It's like, oh, this person's bad. They did this. Oh, I did this thing. That's bad. Like, and positivity, there's like sex positivity and body positivity and all this stuff. But it's actually like, what did you do? What was good about it? What can you do next? What will be good about that? Like, people don't think of positivity in like real, like person to person way anymore. I think that has a huge effect. Like just people don't conceptualize positivity, or they don't see their actions in that way almost ever. So like,
what do you mean
like,
by that? Are they not seeing the full picture? Or
I think people, I mean, this is like a huge generalization. I'm not like a PhD or something. I think a lot of people, because of the way society is right now and everything is about like call out culture and all that kind of thing and like what was bad, that people are not thinking of like what was positive, what was good, what was productive, what was like the good thing that happened. They're always just thinking like, oh, this thing happened, this small bad thing, when you talk about the bad thing. Like it just, I feel like that's what a lot of people do, like especially online. Like you could go to like a lecture and the lecture was great and one person said one thing about pronouns and that's the only thing you talk about. Like, for example, so when it comes to like a person to person situation, people are the same, I think, of only picking out like the bad things and instead of like reinforcing the positive actions or the positive experiences. That's what I'm seeing, like at least with young people.
There was that guy. Something just happened on Twitter. I don't know the whole details, but some guy, a video surfaced of him, either a video or some blog post of him when he was 16, and he said something that was anti-Semitic,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And then he came out and he gave apology, and then everybody's like praising him for the apology or whatever, you know. And there's like the subsidiary drama around the subsidiary drama, but the way in which we don't allow ourselves to not just be embodied, but be extended through time, not just extended through space, but through time. Like I'm here, and then I go over here, and that we just lock on to this one. We've vivisected ourselves in so many different ways, just so we can have that one little thing that we talk about and flick around at each other and participate in that little shuffleboard of internet conversation. And
Well,
I just
I
wish,
think it has. Oh, sorry.
yeah, this last thing. I think like that is probably the result of us not really reading novels anymore, or like seeing long form media. And I just thought of like long form TV is should be the replacement of that, where you see 7 seasons of somebody going through all this development or something like that.
I think that has a lot to do with the like not having a process of questioning or exploration. You're just fed what is correct and what you should think and what is right, and then everybody assumes like, oh, I was fed the correct information and you didn't like agree, therefore you're wrong. That's it. Like everything is like very black and white, which doesn't allow for like growth or like questioning or exploration, which is ultimately like has a huge effect on like the brainwashing of teens in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. There's a food analogy about like white bread or like something with a lot of roughage, where you really have to work to get to the nutrients, and we've made it so easy to get to the nutrients that there's all this other additives that slipped right into the nutrients that we're not aware of.
And also part of it is like kids, because they have access to all this information and they know like the correct things from like a young age, like when they get their smartphone at 12 or whatever, or I don't know how, like 8, I don't know when kids get smartphones, that they assume that they're mature and that they know what's right, and if you didn't, you're stupid. Why didn't you bother to educate yourself? It's really disturbing.
And I actually hear this from parents a lot. They'll say, I want to be able to talk to my kids about their identity, but they're so much smarter than me. I mean, they have all this language, they have all this terminology. And I mean, sometimes that has to do with specific kind of dynamics happening within that family. But it is an interesting way of being like pseudo mature, just because you can rattle off a bunch of definitions, but that doesn't really substitute for actual life experience and the maturity that just takes time. It doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't get maturity from a screen or a book. It's experience. And I think a lot of people now think that because they are woke or whatever, that they're mature, and that's end of quest, like nothing else. That's it. Like it's extremely reductive and backwards.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole utopian mindset just completely, it's like a pair of lenses that completely cut off. You know that everything now is bad and everything that's in the future is good, but like the whole process of getting from here to there is scrunched down, and the whole process of actually owning all these words and moving them around in a unique way. And that's human nature. It's totally just human nature. And I don't know how else you counter that other than just continuing to engage with the ideas and give people access to people engaging with the ideas, in a way.
Yeah. What I've had, not to be like narcissistic, but I've had some people message me after watching my videos or after following me on Twitter, and they're like, the questions that you asked that I couldn't answer are what made me start to ask questions. They're like, seeing you fight with trans activists and be like, why can't you define this word? And then being like, well, I can't either. That's weird. I should know that, right? Or that's what makes them start to question everything. The fact that they were never able to question in the first place. I think that's very powerful, just giving people the questions that they aren't able to ask themselves. Yeah. so far
That
that's
completely
what my
undermines
experience
our whole thesis that the internet is garbage. And here us three are on the internet all the time.
Fight fire with fire or something. I
You've
don't know.
saved us all, Ben.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the internet's really a double-edged sword.
It really is. It really is.
Well, I think somebody said that I always end things awkwardly, but we are at time because you had sushi.
Yeah.
And Sasha's got some sort of cow part to process.
This was
And you
cool
have
though.
some kind of undecided dinner plans.
Hopefully
you-
not
yeah.
chips.
No, I should
Yeah,
have
not
something.
chips. No more chips for the day.
No, there was only 5 to begin with, or to end with, actually. Did you guys have any more statements or any questions to leave people with? Or a funny anecdote from the last
I
3
think
months?
that something Sasha said about how a lot of people have experienced similar things to what you're experiencing now, but not through the lens of queer theory or social justice. Just like
Yeah.
talking to women about the way they were like sexually objectified like 40 years ago. You can relate to that now. Like, I think that if people start to understand that like everything is not new, it's not this way now because of the internet. It's always been this way. People can start to kind of step back from the internet and be like, oh, it's not just that, it's everywhere. I don't know. I think that like speaking to people who've experienced like butch lesbians who've experienced like dysphoria or whatever, like just looking like historically at what's happened before, I think will be helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah. That there have been solutions for these problems, just with different names.
Yeah. Or just like relating to like your grandmother that you've both experienced this kind of like sexual harassment or something that can have like a huge effect on someone. I don't think anybody's trying that kind of thing right now because everything is online.
Everybody's running towards their trauma clubs instead of looking for people who've gone through it and are over it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the common humanity thing, just
Exactly.
recognizing yourself and others, even if they're not exactly like you. Like you talked earlier about how you thought only other trans people could be your supports, but really realizing that your supports can come in like surprising places.
Yeah. Like my first best friend, like as an adult, was a man, and I was like, "That's not right. I'm a radical feminist." That's not how the world works, though. Like, people are people, and you connect with who you connect with. Yeah, like, yeah, things can be unexpected but good, which I didn't accept as a teenager.
That's it. I'm going to cut it there.
Okay, bye, people.
I
Ben, I have a question. Benjamin, I have a question for you.
So.
Are you